Welcome everyone to this third episode of our expert discussion series, focusing on countries with economies in transition, and especially Eastern Europe and the South Caucasus. Uh, Today, we have the alluring title of Structural Growth, Innovation and Diaspora, New Economic Development Models in Small Transition Economies. And our focus will be on the potential of and what we can do and what public policy can do to engage the diaspora better, which of course has a track record of making an enormous difference in countries like, let's say, India and Israel, and also some of our member states. Our guest is Professor Gevorkyan. He's a macroeconomist working on post-socialist economic transition and what he now calls diaspora economics, and which he will explain to us. And he is from St. John's University in New York. Welcome, Professor Gevorkyan.
Thank you. Thank you, Anders.
Okay, so we'll start with allowing Professor Gevorkyan to speak. I will ask a few questions and some follow-up. And then after 20-30 minutes, we want to open the floor for your comments, your discussions, and your concerns from your countries and from your work. So, Professor Gevorkyan, tell us a little bit about what your main interests are, what you're passionate about. And I should mention at this point, and we'll put a link up in the chat, that we already had a podcast episode with you where you talked with passion on transition economies and post-communist dynamics. So tell us a little bit about.
Thank you, Anders. I think that still remains to be my passion, and fitting broadly into a topic of small economies, macroeconomic development. And Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union countries are the specific sort of case studies, if you will, that I'm interested in. There are a lot of reasons why, which we can go into in depth if you'd like, but mostly I think it is one of the overlooked and omitted group of countries, in fact. And you know, if with Central and Eastern Europe, it's sort of maybe not so, given their relatively successful integration within the European Union and global economy. In the case of the former Soviet Union countries, and I'm specifically interested in the small countries, so we have the Caucasus, Central Asia, but if you think also maybe Moldova, which we had a chance to kind of related to that country, we had a project that we partnered on. I think there needs to be more attention and more sort of this sort of higher level discussion on the economic models that are emerging there or that are sort of shaping up. So that is very interesting to me. That's number one. Topic number two is the general analysis of the trends in emerging markets, related also to open economy topics, and that is the exchange rates, sovereign debt, these type of issues that I work on. And third is the topic of diaspora. And as the more I see sort of work that is being created by colleagues across different fields, and now more in international business and international diplomacy and so on, there's more and more you see the term diaspora being used. So I thought I'd just start using a phrase, diaspora economics. And with that, by that, I mean, I connect sort of the two probably at first, at some time ago, unrelated subjects together. Sort of the fact that there's a existent large population of people who identify themselves with something other in addition to the country where they live, but also sort of the questions in those other countries about development and whether or not diaspora can play a role in that. So those three sort of fields that are on my mind these days.
Excellent. So maybe just to take a step back and frame where you're coming from with diaspora economics. And by the way, we will put up your relevant publications and links to them in the chat as they come up. You had a couple of articles where you talk about the transition in general, what you call history's chokehold, which I think we all can subscribe to some extent. And especially what's happened the past 5 years and what the next development models are. And that, I think, is where you see diaspora engagement, or more systematic diaspora engagement, as one of the most promising avenues. So frame a little bit
Yeah.
for us why the diaspora is
So,
so important.
so that for me is a bigger topic. I was asked to actually in separate discussions, but the end product was that essay, sort of a review of 5 years since 2018. Why is it 5 years since the publication of Transition Economies, my book on this subject? And I was trying to find a sort of a better angle, better approach, and we know we've been living through a very difficult 4 years actually. And why is the choice of the title? Maybe it is a bit extravagant, but the really important reminder in the title is the role of history. How fragile is the situation that was created in the aftermath of the 1990s. And what was created was a sort of emergence of independent nation states, effectively, right? And in many cases, for the first time in over 500 years, in some cases for the first time ever. So that's very important to sort of appreciate and remember, not necessarily just, in a pure socioeconomic development sense, sort of what this means in terms and the dynamics that evolve in such situations. And so now 30 years since, it seemed like in economic terms, sort of the 90s, yes, was an incredibly difficult time. And again, again, I'm omitting a lot of details, but it was very difficult times for a lot of small countries, especially. But now the conversation goes, we're out of that and we're moving into a new direction. Yes, we are indeed moving in a new direction. Almost in every country, in fact, in every country, there is access to the internet to some relative extent, and some more, and some other, and some less. People have cell phones, but what is actually also happening is that there's significant socioeconomic pressures and vulnerability that is still persistent. And the smaller the country in economic context, not just geographic context, the more difficult those pressures and more intensely those pressures are felt. So history's chokehold is, well, now we have to think about this as sort of in more analytical terms. Um, what is the path that the countries are on? So that is where I discuss sort of the evolving situation, the macroeconomic difficulties, the geopolitical pressures, and at first a very incomplete list of choices, which goes back in history. What do we have to choose from? We know that the economic development process, sort of we credit that to the period of post-World War II times and the post-colonial movement and the search for indeed sort of what is the best model that the advanced world could offer to at that time developing economies, and many of them are still categorized that way. So in my mind, we are going through somewhat a similar moment. It's not going to be the same or have the same relevance if you think about, let's say, Poland or Czech Republic. But if you think about Romania, Bulgaria, and then Georgia, Armenia, then and Moldova, there are some similarities. Again, they're going to be very different depending on the country context. But the fact that, well, we've got to this point, we know this much. How do we proceed further? So that's where, if you want me to talk about this now, that's where I go into sort of first the risks, but then the scenarios. Maybe I will just summarize the scenarios right now. And when I first started thinking about this was actually mid 2020, right in the beginning of the pandemic. before anything else that started happening in the world. And already back then, it was clear that what we refer to as advanced economies were sort of emphasizing some type of a internal restructuring, talking about sort of bringing, well, creating more job opportunities at home, sort of reshoring, right? That's the new term, and prioritizing local production, because if you remember, the first few months of 2020 were sort of marked by massive economic sort of activity stoppages, right, and massive unemployment growth, massive unemployment. So that had, I think, that had left a significant mark overall on global economy, but also internally, right? And it created also, again, this is maybe for a separate conversation, a very different sort of the political environment and the sort of political scientists to discuss. So in this environment, it was quite obvious that the smaller countries are going to be left out because they didn't really have so many resources to battle the pandemic. There was a whole debate also on access to vaccines and such. So that's the sort of the origin of that thinking in terms of the scenarios, and they're quite straightforward, I think. And I would be happy to sort of receive any critique on that or maybe suggestions how to expand this. But my point is that we should be having this conversation. So very briefly, the first one, there are five, right? The first is that suggests something of a big push, popular ideas for the students of economic development who might remember these things, popular ideas, and we could think of some examples of that. Maybe I would fit probably like Japan or even South Korea into that category. And that's the idea that reforms are across, sort of all across the economy, so all-encompassing, and perhaps there is a leading sector, but eventually everything pulls so all the other sectors with it, and there's a sort of significant qualitative and quantitative transformation. Right now, the problem, of course, is that our small countries that we have in mind right now may not really have that capacity, right? And just in general, technical capacity. And the second is the financing of the entire enterprise. If the examples that I mentioned, Japan, South Korea, there was a significant funding that was coming from elsewhere. The second option might be integration with the primary trading partners. So that's actually what has happened over the past 30 years. Again, if we think about Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, sort of integrating into the European Union economy to the extent that they sort of, I don't want to say dependent, but they very much are sort of comprise that larger EU economy. So that is a choice, right? And then we can look at the trading patterns, and this is something that your group studies and probably knows even in much more detail than others. And that is fine. Okay, so whatever the other implications are for that. The third option is the sort of a silly idea, but some sort of a union or some type of a cooperation movement among the smaller economies. And this could happen probably realistically in the context of sort of non-tangible some type of services because of the geographic distances. Perhaps that is somewhere where multilateral agencies could play a role of helping these countries create a platform. And that would deal with the one of the sectors that I try to talk less about, and that is the information technology sector, because that seems to be the most popular topic to discuss.
Not because it's not important, but because there's been a lot of emphasis on it, I would guess.
Yeah. So I think I will come back to it somehow in my remarks in my mind. The fourth is the actual potential of diaspora, which I think we will explore a bit more in detail. So I'll just mention that there is a um, there's evidence and there's discussion. There are models that are being prepared, discussed for involving the sort of the diaspora populations of different countries in the process of economic development. But the fifth is probably the least sort of costly one, and that is just to leave things as they are and see what happens. And that may depend on the political cycle, right? So the preference is internally. In other words, I can talk about these five scenarios, maybe even six, and so on as an analyst, as an economist. But what really matters is what happens on the ground. And the fifth, just things are going okay. We have a large investor here, a large investor there, and that is sort of conveyed to the general public and such as here's an example of economic success, is a possibility, sure. But I don't, in my opinion, it does not result, sort of these one-off projects do not result in a larger change that I have in mind, the macroeconomic change that I have in mind. So that's
Um,
somewhat
yeah,
briefly.
yeah, excellent. I mean, I would love to have an in-depth discussion on all of those, and also looking at more broadly at the similarities and differences of transition economies, which both are striking, actually, to me. But to sort of complement your framing and then go into the importance of the diaspora, uh, one way of sort of seeing the transition, especially in the former Soviet Union countries, apart from the Baltics, which are sort of a separate story in many ways,
Mhm.
is that you had this first phase where economic linkages broke down, where exchange rates floated, where prices were liberalized, where there was enormous social harm and an enthusiasm, an overweening enthusiasm of how quickly you could simply design healthy capitalism, let's say, same way we used to think we could design an economy.
Yep.
Uh, so that led to rapid decline in growth, sometimes over 30, 40%. And then sort of in the beginning of the 2000s, especially in countries like Georgia, but also others, you saw a whole slate of reform, and um, you saw um, you saw the economy recovering, but it was mostly investment into areas that made sense anyway, and mostly for domestic consumption, and to some extent retaining economic activities that were able to survive. What we saw relatively little of, and what's important, I think, in the next step of the transition is the innovation that we need to find other activities where countries can be competitive, and especially small countries, the niches. And that requires trying out all kinds of things. Um, and that's what we call innovation. And if you look at the exceptions to this, such as the automotive sector in Moldova and Uzbekistan, and the ICT sector in several countries, there's very often an involvement of the diaspora, or at the very least an involvement of foreign direct, not only investment, but also transfer of skills and expertise. So tell us, based on the framing that you provided and that I tried to sort of
Hmm.
complement from my end, um, what is the importance of diaspora for innovation and diversification and providing opportunities to reduce inequality um, more broadly? And maybe you could start with a couple of examples where maybe outside of the region where the diaspora
Hmm.
um, made a tremendous difference and why that was. And then we'll move on to countries in the
Yeah.
region.
Okay. But before I get to that, I think the earlier point that you raised on the difficult times in the 90s, that was actually the hope, right? That once we sort of launch the reforms, there's going to be some sort of a natural process of self sort of sorting, and the winners will eventually rise. And that was one of the miscalculations if we look at it from our times, but who knows what the actual conversations were within the closed doors. But really, what was missing was the competitive aspect of the industrial capacity of former Soviet Union countries and some Eastern European countries, not all, because as I mentioned, the three sort of, in my mind, the three or four sort of winners in Central Europe would be Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland of this process. They quickly were able to leverage the geographic proximity to European Union, but also their established industrial capacity, which was all built in the 50s or so, except for Czech Republic, which had pre-existing stronger conditions. But also,
It was at one point the most industrialized
yes,
country
yes,
in Europe as a
right,
percentage of the economy. So they
right.
had sort of a critical mass to build on, and Poland
Exactly.
also to some
So,
extent.
so yeah. So when and then let's not forget the just sort of the general people, right? Population, well educated and with strong work ethic, but also low cost compared, let's say, to West German realities, but also what you mentioned importantly, enthusiastic, right? Sort of, here's a German factory coming to town. Okay, wonderful. This is how we build new life. And you know, you can't blame people, but that was sort of the situation that was unraveling, and that brings us to here. In the case of former Soviet Union country, the sort of the competitive qualitative output was quite significantly different, right? And the cheaper and better quality imports immediately flooded, and that led to erosion of the industrial base, which came on top of the breakup of the administratively held trade links, right? So within the former Soviet Union, those countries depended on each other to produce very minor things, routine sort of, I don't know, sitting in a chair at the desk, so routine furniture items for a household. And when we also students of history know that this was not a bloodless transition, right? So when the different conflicts started to erupt, those trade links started to simply disappear, not just erode. So
And
that's
and very quickly it was the speed of the adjustment that
oh, that's not very quickly. That's a longer topic. The speed was
no, but
something that was yes, yes,
the
you're right.
speed of if you you know there were no real price signals. The prices were fixed, right? So you didn't know what could be competitive and what couldn't be competitive. And then when you have so much integration, the risk of investing in anything else that might be productive is going
Right.
to be too high.
So, and
So
that brings to the second part of your question, because the speed of this sort of, let's call it transformation politely, but in some cases really just destruction of the economic capacity until today. So you travel the region, and your colleagues that travel the region, you will see in some of the remote areas in the Caucasus, there's sort of remnants of a what looks like an industrial space, sort of the bricks and such, and you would ask, well, what was going on here? This was some sort of a factory that was something in the, let's say, technical industry. I'm not really well versed with the terminology in the tech sector, but it was a factory built in the middle, essentially of nowhere, with very difficult rural areas. But with very sort of unfavorable agricultural conditions. So you can't really say people can survive on agriculture. But the point of that factory being there was to create full employment or provide job opportunities for people living there. That was also part of the sort of the socialist sort of both political and economic promise to the people. So that here's
factory towns, yeah.
right. So we create workspaces for you, and you don't really need to look elsewhere. Sort of happy where you are. Again, that was we're just observing, commenting on the situation. In the 90s, when all of that starts to disappear, because all those factories were supported centrally, and the central market provided the needed demand. Right. That's one of the problems of that socialist system. There are many. One could say there are many socialist systems, but or models, But in that case, it was that centralized market that was the demand for whatever that small factory was producing. And now that disappears, it was almost impossible for the individual producers, even after the process of privatization, to quickly sort of retrofit and upgrade their production capacities, their equipment, and to start producing sort of globally competitive products. Again, it could be very minor things, from pencils, pens, to more sophisticated like TV sets and so on. Importing those products in bulk, in sort of mass imports, was a better option, cheaper and more accessible. So, but what that creates, this type of a situation, it does create a few winners internally, sort of pushes the inequality, because those involved in trade are probably doing a little bit better. With the rise of the banking and financial system that lends sort of credit and such, it becomes also easier, and a new class of sort of industrialists start to emerge, or industrialists is the 19th century word. Sort of the new capital starts to emerge. But the wider economy remains underdeveloped, right? And this is when we start seeing a massive migration out of these countries. It is political migration, it is a migration to escape conflict, but probably 80% of it, conflict, sort of territorial conflicts and wars, but 80% of that migration was probably due to economic reasons. And then come back to the fact that at that time, still, this was mostly one of the highly educated demographic profiles. And those that are relatively sort of engaged in sort of the, I guess, higher skilled, that's the terminology sometimes we use, occupations would be leaving the first, in fact. And with this, so it starts with that, then it turns into rural migration, sort of rural, out of rural areas abroad. Most of this migration is going towards actually Russia, and very little into Europe, or even less into North America. And this is where we come to an important sort of clarification on the concept of diaspora. Because for some countries like Moldova, this was the diaspora forming moment. In conversations with the colleagues from there, sort of they admitted that it is a very new and recent phenomenon for them. But for other groups, let's say, again, for Armenia, since I can talk more about that, definitely, that was just yet another addition to an already existent diaspora, right? Because, which goes back millennia, but we don't need to go that far. But the sort of the relatively active, in the way that people who identify themselves as Armenian starts around the late 19th century, and the descendants of those people living across the world. And the two biggest centers would be United States and Russia these days, and the third would be France, of course. So the arrival of new wave of migrants, right, brings something different into the established communities. And again, in this case, maybe Armenian in this, and now I'm thinking about this, is somewhat unique situation here, because for Bulgaria as well was kind of creation of a new diaspora. For Poland as well, people were moving into, let's say, Ireland, Scotland, but then a substantial number of people would start to come back to Poland as the country's economic situation started to improve. So now we can go into the depths of the conceptual distinctions between recent migration and diaspora. But for practical purposes, I think most of these countries are treating their migrant population that has formed through the 90s and the past 10, 15 years as their diaspora. And in many ways, how this could be sort of contributing to the development. But you asked me to talk specifically about other examples. And we have similar situations as what I just described, let's say, about Armenia. We could talk about China, we could talk about India, Ireland, which is one of my favorites. And I'm glad to see some colleagues joining us from there. So, because these are the countries with something, but Armenia also has a pre-existent diaspora in addition to any other waves, more recent waves of migration, right? And what is common is how things start. Um, then what is different is how things proceed, and what is also common is how things sort of come to I would say, logical continuation, not the conclusion, but the logical continuation of the process. The common start is the sort of the individual initiatives of let's stick with entrepreneurship, with diaspora entrepreneurs, right? They see an opportunity in their home country or the country that is home of sort of their ancestors, right? So I use sometimes term a phrase ancestral homeland. In other words, a person does not have to be born in that country, but through their grandparents, they make the connection, for example. And several countries offer citizenship, and I know, again, this was the case in Ireland, that sort of you have a, even through grandparents connection, then you can apply for Irish citizenship. Poland would later come up with an ID card for global Pole. Estonia, you mentioned the Baltics, would have a global Estonian idea, which is more recent. So the common is the individual start, an entrepreneur taking a risk and moving into a country. Maybe it's a group. For example, in India, it would be a group of professionals working in the Silicon Valley, or in China, individually, but also as a group in the 90s, sort of people moving into the country. How it proceeds is different. That's the second step that I mentioned. And this just evolves in, again, based on individual experiences. Some are unfortunate. They run into the local bureaucracy and become sort of disappointed, and and don't want to connect with the country whatsoever at all. Others are overcoming the local bureaucracy because it is a cultural change, right? Even if you are from the country but have lived outside the country for a year or two, when you come back, it is going to be a slightly different country, even though if you've kept in touch with your relatives or friends and so on, right? So institutionally, countries change somehow for better or worse. But the third, how this continues, is also common in the success cases, and that is that the country, and specifically the government and the various agencies within the government, turn towards their diaspora, right? And this is where, for example, like in the monumental way, India reverses its policy and starts to acknowledge the non-resident Indians, people of Indian origin, and create various practical ways of connecting with India on sort of as simple as simplifying money transfers and access to funding for in between the sender abroad and the receiver in India, to much more complex sort of initiatives such as helping and motivating growth in our favorite IT sector and such. Sort of it again, policy-wise, it gets very detailed, sort of questions on taxation, questions on I guess repatriation of capital and so on. Ownership of land, ownership of property, citizenship, and the voting rights. So different countries sort of come up with their own set of measures that they find appropriate. But what is important in the sort of third phase of continuation of engaging with diaspora is that there is some type of infrastructure that is being created, maybe in the still the beginnings of it, but there are attempts that are visible. And what is important is the bigger diaspora. So the entrepreneurs were the first to move in, but the bigger diaspora is on the sidelines and is watching. They're very receptive of these changes. It is a very sensitive subject, and sort of when it's only positive news, people are skeptical. But when it is more or less of a mix of realistic news, people then start taking the risk on their own and saying, okay, maybe I'll go visit the country. Maybe I will, as an academic, give a lecture or engage in a conference and see how it goes. So it starts, then it proceeds in different ways, it touching different sectors, and then sort of there's the there has to be the capture moment on the side of the state. And to answer your question, that is how I think you can sort of one of the ways. There may be others, but this is one of the ways by very active engagement of the state, of the receiving country, active engagement with their own diaspora. I can go on, but I think I just leave some time for your questions, but I can come back.
We I could also go on. I mean, these are all fascinating topics, and maybe just a few things to sort of strengthen your narrative in the case for this even further. Is that yes, you mentioned that there are risks in these countries, but often the perception of risk can be much higher than the actual risk. And someone who knows the country, who has emotional attachment or an identity closely connected with that country, which is one of the ways in which the Armenian diaspora stands out, also because of a very long history, but in other countries as well. That can, everything else being equal, lead to a slightly higher ability to take on and to manage risks. But the other point that that I would like to add is that we don't know which dynamics are going to come out, but we know that there can be incredibly productive dynamics that get started at some point. So if you look at Israel, the first couple of decades with conflicts and what some call kibbutzim socialism, there wasn't much engagement at all. And then starting in the 70s and especially in the 80s, it took off big time in ways that weren't unexpected. So I think the point is, what can public policy in particular do to sort of enable and to catalyze this dynamic? And maybe while you talk a little bit about that, I would very much invite our participants to think of a few questions. I see we have, for instance, Ukraine in the room, where there is, of course, tremendous potential, or will be, when, as we all hope, the conflict recedes, and maybe also some other questions on what Professor Gevorkyan has said.
Thank you. So as far as public policy,
sorry, everyone, please raise your hands, and I will call on you when they come up. Go ahead, Professor Gevorkyan.
I think there's the first step in terms of public policy, and I'm saying this generally but with an understanding that some are already doing this, of course, but others may need to do a little bit more work. But so the first step is actually to learn your diaspora, to understand what it is that you're dealing with and what it is that you would like to receive. And this has to be done very, very carefully, because this is sort of an interaction among people who are very sensitive, who may have very strong sort of idealistic views about their, again, ancestral homeland, not necessarily in compliance with the views of, and sort of do not conform to the views of the policymakers, right? So this is where you have to be, as a policymaker in the country that is trying to leverage diaspora, have to be first brave, have to be honest with yourself, and prepared to receive suggestions, advice, but also criticism. Now, it doesn't mean that all of that feedback that's coming from diaspora is also relevant and rational. Some of it may not be relevant, but there needs to be a healthy process of discussion, and that requires that massive institutional maturity internally to be able to deal with that. And it's not that simple, right? It's, again, easier to discuss these things, but what sort of one of the examples in the broader region, post-socialist region, that I had a chance to work on and with the UNECE and also study, and that sort of impressed me, is the case of Moldova, right? Because as far as public policy, they're very active in engaging this with this new phenomenon for them, diaspora. They're learning from others, so they have a good idea, good grasp of what it is that their diaspora or migrant population represents. But they're also not afraid to learn from other examples, from other countries. And that to me that is the maturity that I have in mind. That meaning that, okay, I know everything, but I also know that and because I know everything, I know that there's something that I don't know, right? And maybe I'm speaking a bit too highly, but that was the impression that I received. And I think that's interesting, sort of in terms of organizing the hometown associations, in terms of helping those migrants with the funds that go directly towards specific projects in their mostly villages where it's mostly rural migrants, the connections that they establish, as much of it as can be state sponsored, that the better it is. But you could have sort of certain even so it doesn't seem like it's a free trip home or something like that. You do you can create tasks. One can create tasks for participants in any, let's say, forum or scientific forum or some type of event to actually contribute and have an actual sort of value added into the country's development. So I think again, there are many different examples of what can be done. Anything from setting up a platform for engagement that I called once for a diaspora portal for people to be able to sort of post their needs internally, and then also in the diaspora, sort of people with knowledge and skills responding to those needs. Or uh, again, I believe Moldova has this quite explicitly, or setting up something like an economic development program and actually accounting for diaspora's participation in different sectors. I think Armenia is trying to do that. That was there is interest in that, at least. But it is a relatively slow process, and it requires consistent sort of support. This is where multilateral agencies have the technical capacity, as we say, right, to support these initiatives. Um, so these are just some thoughts right now on that. You're on mute, Anders. You're muted.
No, that's excellent. And perhaps one additional important consideration is that there are no pat recipes for this. It's actually a process of discovery.
Right. Yeah.
So it's important to get to know your diaspora, to get feedback, to engage them. But we don't know exactly how and what will work and what will not work. And then if there's dynamism coming from somewhere unexpected, we should be prepared to sort of build on that. So as is the case with innovation policy in general, policymakers also have to be innovative, as we always like to say. So we have a question. Yes, please go ahead. Martin Roland, I think.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
We can't hear you. Marty, we cannot hear
Hello?
you. Okay. No. Maybe you can type your question in the chat. Yeah, so something technical issues. So this is why technology is not going to save us.
Yeah, I'm trying to check here if he's. No, it should work.
No, but Marty, if you type your question in the chat, I'll try to answer it. And thanks in advance for it.
Oh, yes. Yes, we have one here. We say that the diasporas have 3 T's: time, talent, and treasure. It's often their time and talent, for instance, market intelligence, bridging home and global markets, that can spur diversification and innovation. I think, Marty, we can see you now.
We can't hear you though.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Just
Well, maybe Professor Gevorkyan, if maybe you can comment on what Marty said in the chat.
three T's: time, talent, and treasure. That is true, because if you think about this, why would an average person be motivated to do all this? It's a difficult trip sometimes. In many cases, it's a difficult emotional, so costly trip. Emotionally, it is a reconnection with memories maybe that you would like to avoid and not to come back to. Yet people seek the connection, right? And again, in the cases of recent migration, Moldova or Philippines, for example, or in Central America situation, in some situations, I spoke with Central American group earlier this week, or another big example, let's say Mexico, of course. In the as far as recent migration goes, it is somewhat obvious. Okay, people have their family there and such, or Central Asian migration to Russia. Okay, people have left their families, so they're working. It is this operational sort of transactional environment. But for someone who is a second, third, or even more generation born abroad, um, how do you establish this connection? That is, in fact, we are asking for their time. We are asking for their talent and skills, and the knowledge that they bring is the true treasure, right? Um, Again, we may not internally, we as meaning policymakers back home, may not actually agree with these things. Might not be the best sort of the worlds for us to hear criticism directed at us, but such is life. And if you open up to the diaspora, if you say that we are hoping diaspora can be a sort of an equal partner, there are many different ways how you could state this, equal partner in the development process, then it is important to be prepared to sort of accept different position, different viewpoints, especially so because assume that diaspora is arguing or presenting this from a position of relative comfort, right? They've established themselves, um, especially the second, third generation, in a different country, and they are integrated in those societies really well. I see we have another question from Martin Russell. This is going to be a challenging one.
Yes, please go ahead. Make it interesting, Martin.
Perfect. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Look, Alex, always good to learn from you, buddy. You were mentioning Moldova, and I know one of the key lessons that they've learned in Moldova, for example, is that diaspora engagement and particularly investment is often more in tune or kind of desire to have impact at the local level. And you mentioned also the migration flows. So what we're seeing, you mentioned the hometown associations. I'm just wondering, do you see a missed opportunity in that? Because we talk quite a lot about diaspora engagement at the national level. But for example, if you look at the USA Diaspora Invest project, one of the key lessons out of the first phase of that project was that the diasporas didn't necessarily want to invest in the capital city. They wanted to invest in the town and the village of where they're from. So I'm just wondering, do you see that in some of your research as well in terms of going beyond the national to the subnational level maybe, and the role of local government and local authorities in driving diaspora engagement? Thanks,
Yeah.
Alex.
Thank you, Martin. I think so. To me, that example of Moldova is actually very important. The fact that it goes into the outside of the main city, outside of the capital. If we look at Georgia, Armenia, most of it is either, well, Armenia is easy. Most of it is in the capital city. Georgia, it's the capital city and the kind of places by the sea, the sea resorts. But internally, sort of within the country, there's not really that much in terms of the sort of systematic investment. Random, yes, somebody sponsors a school, somebody sponsors to rebuild a road or bridge or get water, or it's a World Bank project. But in my understanding, what is happening in Moldova is actually a little bit wider, and to me that is a good example that smaller countries can could look into and learn from. The next challenge, though, of course, is not just to let things continue the way they are, but actually start thinking at the higher level, the sort of the national level, as well. Okay, we have how sort of balanced is this development across the regions? Maybe that's another part to your question, because that is very important. If we have, and I guess Mexico could be an example, right? We have examples where there's a group of people, recent migrants from one region, and sort of most of the funding goes into that specific region, while others kind of lagging. I don't want to say falling behind, but lagging from that. And that could be an issue. That can be an issue, and very quickly, sort of on a scale of a small country, becomes visible, and start to create social and economic inequalities. So that is where sort of the national level, some administration agency, whatever, has to step in and either compensate or the missing sort of the lagging part by creating similar opportunities, because one could, again, theoretically, I could allow a theoretical thought here, one could hypothetically say that if diaspora sponsors region A, that frees up the money so we can actually direct more to region B. But it's one of the considerations. Or maybe my preferred way would be actually to go back to the diaspora and say, okay, we have another region, and maybe we can devise a new system by which, let's say, 10% of your funding that goes to region A goes also to region B. Somehow to avoid creating these sort of the massive economic differences, right, that would be emerging, and that emerged in the 90s, and was the result. So I think it's a good start, and it's proceeding in an interesting way. So the next step is actually to make it kind of all inclusive in today's language. So we have a question from Marty. I'm in Polish diaspora, grandparents on mother's side. Seems like diaspora is waiting for somebody to do something. Dispersed people can't take a leadership role. There's got to be a model of success. Maybe Poland of where this. How about working with China to set up? Okay, so
Professor Gevorkyan, if I may, I'd like to also bring in Moldova, and then we have Ukraine, and then we have Poland.
All
so
right.
it's a geographic succession. We did just a brief comment. We did a review on Moldova, and you could actually read, perhaps with a little bit of imagination, the emergence of the automotive supply sector as an excellent example of the difference the diaspora can make, underpinned by an export processing zone. So the potential is definitely there, and that's demonstrated. But let's go to Ukraine. I think we have Igor from Ukraine, and then we'll go to Poland.
Yeah, we can go
with apologies for shifting
course.
the order a bit. Please, Igor, good to see you. Go ahead. Good.
Igor, you need to unmute. You muted.
Igor, you're muted. Okay. Igor, if you can't manage to turn on your mic, would you mind typing a question, and then we'll take the Polish question first, and then we'll come to Ukraine.
All right.
So, Igor, it would be great to hear from you. So, yes, we'll definitely get back to you.
Great. So, would you like to read the question, or me to read?
Oh, you already started reading it.
So, okay.
Please.
So we have a question from Marty on Polish diaspora, and he is from Polish diaspora, and it seems like he poses a very interesting, bigger question. It seems like diaspora is waiting for somebody to do something. Dispersed people can't take a leadership role. I think and then let me continue. There's got to be a model of success, maybe Poland. Martin, thank you. Thanks for the question. Thanks for your support.
Thank you.
There's got to be. How about working with China to set up basic income infrastructure for making links? Okay, so Marty Rowland, you have maybe 3 or 4 questions in your one statement. I'll start with what seems to be the first. Seems like diaspora is waiting for somebody to do something. In some ways, perhaps, but maybe there's no need even for that. By the way, we keep sort of talking about this, but maybe there's no need. Or in fact, maybe there's no even a country that a diaspora can connect with. And I'm going to go into something difficult here. Let's say the Assyrian diaspora. So we tend to talk about these things in a way that there's a specific country that our sort of hypothetical or the case study diaspora can connect with, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And this is where, going back to the beginning of the conversation, there's not a simple sort of definition of diaspora, right? In a way that is sort of an operational term, the way policymakers would think about it today. It is a very, very complex entity of people who are connecting with each other, a network, oftentimes a network of people of similar culture, background, religious background, and so on, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be a direct connection with a country that is currently on the world map, which is, I think, important to keep in mind. So with that, then, what type of leadership can we expect, or how do we even approach this question? It becomes a very difficult topic. Second, now for those that can actually connect with an existing country on the map, and by the way, I mentioned one example, but if you think about, let's say, the Ukrainian diaspora, Armenian diaspora, Georgian diaspora, in the times of the former Soviet Union, those were republics, right? But not necessarily direct countries, although there's a long history of attempts to reach out to the different groups. What we see across, especially established diasporas, but I think there's also another phenomenon, and that is due to the changes in technology, right? Changes in how we travel, the ease of access and trips and information. So it is that diaspora groups start to self-organize into different associations abroad. And again, at first, this would be more common for the settled diasporas. In other words, people who have left their country for good and they're not returning. But they try to stay in touch. This is, again, in my experience, so it's like Irish diasporas or the Italian American diasporas early on in the periods of their migration. And then these associations still continue. In the Armenian case, there are organizations that were formed by Armenians from historic Western Armenia in the early 20th century. So those diaspora organizations function on their own, and then it's the leadership of those and membership of those organizations then actually makes the first step oftentimes with the country and tries to establish something, because their entire purpose sort of and almost entire purpose and of existence and legitimacy is actually connecting with the home country, right? Because that's the sort of the cultural, the economic link that they provide to their communities in the diaspora. But that is what I meant, sort of that's the start, that when I talked about the 3 phases, that is just the beginning, right? But then how this evolves is going to depend on the country. So that's where the leadership that Marty mentions can be very relevant. There's no one, as Anders, as you mentioned, there's no one unique model for success other than just hard work. I tried summarizing these thoughts once earlier this week by saying that first the country has to open, right? Second, to actively engage with the diaspora, and then third is to continuously and work on improving. Okay, so we have a question from Igor. I think the Moldova is not the best example, as this country is actively integrated with neighboring Romania. So that's going back to my to my scenarios that it could be a country economy could be integrating with its largest trading partner. So Igor thinks there will be part of of Romania in a few years, and you cannot find a similar situation in Europe. Language is the same, borders could be removed easily. A lot of people have dual citizenship, and immigration flows are already reoriented from Russia to Romania and Italy, if I may add to that. Well, I cannot give predictions on that. All I know is that a hard-won independence is something people try to keep, and historically speaking, right? So that is not something that I can decide, but we're commenting on the current trends, and we are seeing that that is the sort of the operational model is quite significant and important. Something similar probably exists in the Philippines, right? With again, much more sophisticated system, and again, my entry into the sort of in the professional sense of diaspora economics was through learning the experience of the Philippines with labor migration and the facilities that are created in the country, and that are only becoming better and better and more sophisticated. Again, the simplest idea is to set up a website where it is sort of point of entry for anyone abroad, right? And you get all the information that is needed, practical information, not just sort of Wikipedia summary, but the practical information on paperwork that is needed for the country, or in how to transfer money, or what are the priority sort of sectors, and what are the sort of possible beneficiaries of that. And sort of, so again, that is innovation as well. So you're muted, Anders. You're on mute.
And of course, there are always going to be very specific circumstances, such as the shared history and language of Moldova and Romania, and the additional complication of conflict between the Ottoman and the Russian Empire, and of course the fact that they are in the European Union and provide sort of an intro to that. But the case in Moldova was actually a German investor with someone from the Moldovan diaspora, so it can be. You can go further along than that. And if you look at the Philippines, I think what matters quite a bit is 50 years of US colonization, of relative good establishment of English language skills. And if you look at the business process outsourcing services they do, it's mostly to the United States, which of course is not an accident.
Right. And labor migration all the way as far as the Gulf states, right? That is from the Philippines. So that is also quite impressive. But they have the whole system of recruiting agencies, the agreements between the countries, and legislation. Again, something that I wrote some time ago, and again, somewhat of a idealistic academic paper on factoring out turbulence and suggesting a diaspora regulatory mechanism for labor migration processes, and a migration development bank for sort of helping with the remittances flows that are not just individual to the families, but they accrued into a fund, which then can certainly release the funds to the recipient on demand, but is also, as a fund, is also able to accumulate that money, grow that through various financial instruments, and actually invest at home in the economic development or infrastructure development, educational facilities, so that actually to kind of reverse the migration process, right, in a way. Because if it's economic migration, but here we are investing in local development, which is the case of Moldova, then maybe there is no need to migrate anymore. And actually one can stay in their country. Okay, I think we have another question
Yeah,
from the audience. Oscar.
I think we have Marty again, and then we have I saw Oscar Fast's hand
Yeah.
up as well. So I guess we can take those two, and then
let's go to Oscar's
more or less out of time. Oscar, please.
Thanks. Yes, many thanks. So my question would be, so you have raised many examples of diaspora engagement and many channels in which it has occurred, also quite successfully. If you now would look at history, not necessarily by pointing to examples necessarily, but what were like main factors that, let's say, hindered successful diaspora projects or programs, be it steered by the countries themselves or be it steered by international organizations? What were, so to say, the things that have, so to say, hindered more successful implementations? Many thanks.
So you mean something that didn't really work out, right? And what were the factors standing in the way?
Exactly. Exactly. What were like, if there are some patterns, so to speak. Yeah.
Okay. On the general level, it's always about personal experience. What we have in the case of diaspora, we have a very diverse group of people, and many of them are really successful professionally. They sit on the boards of important organizations, companies, and so on. And again, their approach is to a developing country is that we are almost doing a favor to you. So here we are, we're bringing super well-known company XYZ, and or we are willing to sort of invest X amount of hundreds of millions of dollars into infrastructure development. Here's the money. Here's the contact for the company to make the decision. All is needed is your signature. And sometimes these sort of very altruistic attempts, even though they come with massive expense, right, for the giver, run into local bureaucracy, misunderstanding, and poor governance. And I think you get the concept, but I tried to put that as politely as possible. So that is very disappointing, and that shows that to those investors or potential investors or benefactors, it shows that okay, these guys are not really serious about developing the country. All they are thinking about is some type of, either they're thinking about personal gains out of this initiative, or they don't even have the vision. Because there's another thing with diaspora, with all its altruism, it has this greater vision for what can be, how a country can be, how a country can develop. There's a bit of the mismatch there. Sometimes a bit too altruistic and a bit too hopeful on the part of diaspora. So let's put it as misunderstanding of what is happening, and that is one of the biggest problems. But then there's also something else, and that gives you an opportunity to talk about another topic within the diaspora economics, which I try to work on, and that is actual financial instruments, right? Developing financial instruments for attracting funds from the diaspora. The most popular, you must have heard, is the diaspora bond, actually issuing a sort of a government security, which acts as a treasury bond, right? As a financial instrument, a debt instrument that allows countries, I was going to say companies, that allows countries to raise funds and attract funding into infrastructure projects. The most successful, and in my mind, the only successful case is the case of Israel bond, which has been now in its 75 or so years and running. And many countries have tried that and haven't been really successful. One of the bigger sort of failures, I guess that's the case because it didn't really work out, was the idea of fundraising by Greece and borrowing from the Greek diaspora at the times of the Greek crisis in the Eurozone. So just 15 or so years ago. And then, but then there are others, right? And so this idea it has some type of a cycle. I haven't figured out how and what determines the frequency of the cycle, but it actually comes up and goes, fades away, and then comes back. But one of those factors that go towards your question, right? One of those factors that acts as an obstacle in a successful diaspora engagement is this lack of understanding of what the diaspora is on the part of the country that is trying to connect with the diaspora, but also in the general sort of international business world, the multilateral agencies world, and so on. There's an assumption that if someone is of a certain background, then they, by definition, have a sense of belonging to the country XYZ. But that is not the case, right? It may just be the last name that is similar to the last names from that country, and the person themselves do not really identify themselves with that culture. That's the simplest step, right? But in the more complex ways within the diaspora, there's incredible amount of multi-layering. I mentioned a little bit about the different waves of migration. That is also sort of self-evident. You have it's what I call older diaspora. That's let's say the second, third generation, and sort of what we know, like again, I mentioned the Irish Americans, Italian Americans, or the Armenian diaspora across the world. So people who have lived in the countries outside of their homeland for generations. And then we have the new diaspora, the more recent migration in the context of our region over the past 30 years. But then there's actually something else, and that is goes back to the idea that we're just individuals living in a society, and we have our different views, different opinions, different political preferences, and different knowledge and understanding of social processes. So this is where there's no unity necessarily, even if a country is in crisis, because it's often said that when the country is in crisis, diaspora helps out. But not everyone helps out. There are going to be substantial groups that will sort of resist from participating in these initiatives. So it's I guess to summarize, the first part is the lack of institutional maturity in the receiving country on number one. Number two, maybe it's actually a lack of relevant vision from the diaspora itself, because again, the diaspora could approach the country as in very idealistic way, and also oftentimes from top down, which is not really appreciated in the home country, and may not even be sort of called for. So in the context of former socialist countries, the diaspora, and especially the younger generation that is already born abroad, they grow up on the stories of their parents, grandparents, which go back to the 1980s or environment of early 1990s, which is now somewhat different on the ground, right? So lack of institutional maturity at home, lack of the diaspora reasonable propositions or practical operational transactional projects. And the third is the back in the country or multilateral agencies, sort of lack of understanding of the diaspora potential. So if there is money to be spent, that is where it should go, to understand who are these people that we refer to as diaspora.
Swedish Bastiat talks about the seen and the unseen, and I think that might be particularly important in this context. What we see are the things that work well or didn't work well. What we don't see are all the things that we're missing out on, the things that could happen maybe with a little bit of tweak and a little bit of experimentation and learning here and there. And I think that should sort of be at the center of this ambition.
Yep.
Let's finish with we have one question left from Marty Roland. Marty, maybe you can speak, or otherwise we'll read from the chat.
China Belt Road to be an option for this economic development in nations and their diasporas. anything that brings more money into the countries could be an opportunity. So Marty's question is, do you see China's Belt and Road to be an option for this economic development between nations and their diaspora? It is possible. Why not? I mean, it all depends how and money is spent, what the specific projects are. But I think when we also, to Anders's earlier point, the opening point, when we think about diasporas, we also think about the sort of the collective, we use the word potential, right? But it is the collective potential that diaspora engagement brings. And it often starts on its own in very diverse ways. What matters is sort of there's several factors, right? What matters is the conditions in the country, but also the conditions in the diaspora. Sort of what is the position that our diaspora investor is, what is starting from, what is their foundation. I'm forever impressed by a case of development of wine industry in Armenia. There are several sort of several groups that can claim to be sort of at the beginnings of it, but to me, what is impressive is a person who grew up in Italy, of Armenian descent, grew up in Italy, packs up and just relocates to Armenia, and now that wine is Bloomberg's top 10 of the world wines. So I give the promotion.
No.
Right. So it's quite incredible, and single-handedly, essentially creating this wine culture, which is you guys should all try, and it's growing, but that's just that case, and we know the other cases. We know about India, we know about Ireland as well. So in Central Asia, I guess that's what Marty's question on China Belt and Road, it is a possibility, but it cannot just, the funding but in of its own is not the sufficient condition. Let's put it this way. There needs to be this enthusiasm that comes from the diaspora, and it can be personal, it can be altruistic, patriotic of some sort. It can also be actually a convenient opportunity at the right time. For example, engaging with scientists, and this is one of the innovative aspects. And I know, again, I have to mention that I know a group and I work with a group that works with Armenia in this way. And it is a group that is trying to bring together scientists of Armenian descent from across the world, right? And for a lot of them, especially in natural sciences, it is, in a way, in practical way, a low cost but effective sort of opportunity to establish a lab in Armenia and conduct sort of world-class experiments in physics and so on. I don't know if this will work out, but at least there are steps taken there, and that has to, again, funding aside, there has to be this enthusiasm that comes from within the diaspora. That is why it is so important to understand your diaspora before you announce any big policies.
My colleagues might be tired of hearing this, but one thing I like to say is that Bill Gates didn't play around with computer in his garage because he wanted to be a billionaire.
Right.
This enthusiasm sort of has to be part and parcel of that, and it has to be sort of encouraged and harnessed in some way. And there's a lot of money out there. In fact, that's why we have inflation. The real hard work is to create sort of the dynamism that creates a range of products that are attractive and bankable. And then you can use that finance well. So it's not about the amount of finance, but it's what you do with it and what you create with it.
Yep.
Good. I think
what happened?
do we have another question? I see a hand up here. No, it's Marty, and I guess we covered that question.
Yep.
Good. Well,
Okay,
thank you, Professor Gevorkyan. It's been an excellent discussion, and I encourage everyone to read his articles and maybe have a listen to the podcast episode. We'll put a link up to it that we did a year ago on transition economies. And it would be great to have you again and explore some of these topics little bit more.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anders. Thank you, everyone. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.